with our NATO allies to ensure Ukraine is flying F-16s this summer. And we show the world that we stand with Ukraine now and in the future.
House Democrats will win back control of the House of Representatives on November 5th.
He's looking forward to this opportunity to close out the NATO summit with a strong summation of it and with the opportunity to take questions from reporters.
Hello, I'm Weijia Jiang in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. President Biden is holding a rare solo press conference today, his first one since November. It's one of his biggest public tests since last month's poor debate performance. A growing number of Democratic lawmakers are calling on the president to step aside. Last night, Vermont Senator Peter Welch explicitly called on him to drop out of the race. Senate Democrats met with top Biden advisors today. Our Major Garrett and Ed O'Keefe joins us now. Major,
yes.
To say this is a lot of pressure on Biden is an understatement. And because you love baseball, what if he knocks it out of the park? Is that enough to make all this skepticism about him go away?
Weijia, it's a great question. Let's simplify it. Can a press conference save a presidency? What? That very question is absurd. And yet, it is a question a fair number of Democrats in the House and Senate are asking themselves this very afternoon. Can a press conference save a candidacy and, by extension, a presidency for a seeking to have a second term? That's what this is about. One press conference. And it's not as if President Biden can get 6 answers correct and vigorous and strong and not bungle the 7th and have it be a successful press conference.
There is no room for error.
He has to be 7 for 7 or 8 for 8 or whatever the number is. And that kind of scrutiny will not end this afternoon, Weijia. It will calm some nerves in the Democratic Party. But already today before the press conference, we had 4 House Democrats who had said nothing publicly say he should step aside. Even before the press conference, when the orientation on the Hill was at least wait for the press conference. They're not waiting. And so this pressure is quite evidently building, and a press conference may slow it down, may recontextualize it, but does it make it go away? I think the clear answer to that is no.
And Ed, of course, President Biden and his campaign would argue there is no need to try to convince the American people because the bottom line is that he is the best person to beat Donald Trump. And you obtained a memo today that the campaign is circulating that says that. What else does it say?
Right. Well, it says a handful of things, and you got to remember whose logo and name is at the top of it. It's the president. So, of course, it's going to give a somewhat positive assessment. And what it acknowledges is, yes, there was a bit of a slide in support for the president after the debate, but, quote, not a sea change. They've seen some slippage among elements of the Democratic base, younger, female, minority voters, not drifting to President Trump. They don't like him, the memo says. They're drifting back to the couch, perhaps, or they're just not as engaged. But with 4 months to go, the campaign would argue they got plenty of time to bring them back into the fold. The other thing it says, independent voters didn't break in any demonstrable way to former President Trump after the debate, an encouraging sign for the president. The biggest tell, however, I think in this memo is it says they've polled the vice president's chances against the former president. And it is their conclusion that President Biden still is the only Democrat who can defeat Trump. That signals that it answers perhaps the next question after the president should go, well, then whom? And says that Harris may have chances, but is not currently beating him, at least the way they do the polling, however they do the polling, because they don't tell us that. That flies in the face of public polling that in recent days has shown the vice president maybe up a point or two compared to the current president against Trump. And so, you know, that's still to be seen. And either way, in all of these surveys, it's still only single digits, whether it's a national survey of all voters, whether it's a national survey of likely voters, whether it's a battleground state survey of likely voters, whether it's any state survey of human beings, it's still a single-digit contest, no matter how you cut it, which to the Biden team would suggest the debate really didn't have that big of an effect, and all this coverage, pearl-clutching, and declarations that he needs to get out are unnecessary. And the memo warns, best way to help Trump right now, fellow Democrats, is to keep this up next week instead of focusing on what Republicans are up to in Milwaukee.
Well, there's no question, though, that the debate did have an impact on members of his own party, Major. And you spoke with one of the congressmen who's willing to put his name publicly with that sentiment. What did he say?
Adam Smith is his name. On Monday, he made his feelings about this clear. Joe Biden, President of the United States, should step aside because he's got a good message but can't deliver it, is trailing former President Trump, and the disastrous debate performance, his words, not mine, make all of these problems worse and more apparent and more problematic for the future of the Democratic ticket and any aspirations Democrats might have to win back the House or keep the majority, slim though it is, in the United States Senate. And I asked him a number of questions. Among them, what do you say to the White House and the Biden campaign that says, A, he's in, you shouldn't be barking at him to get out, and even if he did step down, as you want, Adam Smith, it would create chaos for the party. Here's his response.
We got a great opportunity here. All right. Everyone's acting, oh, it'll be a mess. It'll be terrible. Look, the country has been saying since the start of this campaign, give us somebody different. They've been begging for somebody different. If the Democratic Party at a convention with our delegates came out and gave them somebody different, I think we would get an incredible boost out of that.
I asked Congressman Smith, if President Biden, very large if, were to step aside, is Vice President Kamala Harris heir apparent? He said, yes, she is. I said, any suggestions for a potential running mate? Adam Smith said, if I were her, I would pick Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, and double down, put 2 women on the ticket. He said, almost all of our history, it's been 2 dudes, and no one was ever worried about that. Why not have 2 women and make that a defining, not only visible, symbolic representation where the Democratic Party is, but galvanize people around issues related to reproductive freedom and the like. Not saying that's indicative of anything, but that was his point of view.
Well, and she is certainly a recognizable name in the mix of possible candidates.
And in a very vital state.
Exactly. Ed, you know, the House Democrats are one thing, but when it comes to Senate Democrats, I imagine President Biden, who served alongside many of them, care a lot about what they have to say. Exactly why his advisors went up to Capitol Hill and met with the Senate Democrats today. What can you tell us about that meeting?
It was a necessary conversation between those that you said could have outsized influence over the president and have a lot to lose should the Senate slip into Republican hands next year. The fact that he sent Jennifer O'Malley Dillon, his campaign chief, Mike Donilon, many believe is sort of the heart and soul of the president, as one of his speechwriters and message crafters, and then Steve Ricchetti, who is the lead legislative liaison to Capitol Hill for the White House. It was designed to sort of stoke egos, temper expectations, and beg for patience. By all accounts, it appears to have been a somewhat stressful or sensitive meeting, although full details aren't yet necessarily available, as it seems many are trying to withhold the real details of it because, the smaller the meeting, the less likely people are going to want to share thoughts on it. But it's not like everybody came out and was singing Kumbaya, right? Or that support's been reaffirmed by everyone else in the Democratic caucus but Peter Welch. So we'll have to wait and see, ultimately, how some of those senators feel. I think it was notable that Joe Manchin, who apparently still gets invited to these meetings despite now being an independent, said that he believes we'll have a much better sense of where things are headed come Sunday. I believe one of the reasons he says Sunday is because we've gotten indications that the various entities that support and help run Democratic campaigns in the Senate, at least, and to some extent in the House, are going to have solid poll data that accounts for opinions post-July 4th. When people were back at work or back from vacation or at least a little more engaged, then data that would have been taken in the first week since the debate, which involved the July 4th holiday. And that is considered junk data because the country was so scattered on the beach, in the mountains, at a parade. And so if they see something this weekend in that data that suggests further trouble, especially in places like New Mexico or Minnesota or New Hampshire, which are sort of secondary battleground states, that will cause other senators potentially to start speaking out.
Well, in this story, Ed, Sunday seems like a lifetime away, but we will
Sure does.
be following all the twists and turns. Major Garrett and Ed O'Keefe, thank you. Today, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the U.S. must lift limits on Ukraine's military strikes. White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby shares his response with us next. You're streaming America Decides. President Biden held a bilateral meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky today as the NATO summit in Washington comes to a close. President Biden told his Ukrainian counterpart the U.S. will be with Ukraine, quote, every step of the way in its war against Russia. He also announced even more military aid for the nation only 2 days after pledging additional air defense equipment to Ukraine.
Today, I'm proud to announce new security assistance package for Ukraine. This will be the 8th package I've authorized since we've signed the National Security Bill.
White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby is at the Washington Convention Center where the NATO summit is happening. Admiral, it's great to see you.
Thanks. Good to be with you, Ouija.
Today, President Biden reiterated a message that he has long said to President Zelensky of Ukraine, that we will stay with you, period. But we also know that Zelensky said today that in order to defeat Russia, in order to win, the U.S. must lift limits on using its weapons to strike military targets in Russia. Is the U.S. prepared to do that?
We've been in active conversations with the Ukrainians since the beginning of the war about their needs, the capabilities that they require, the guidance that governs the use of some of those weapons. As you know, Ouija, the president just recently allowed them to use U.S. weapons in cross-border strikes to get at imminent Russian threats. There's been no change other than that. We understand the Ukrainian desires, of course, and President Zelensky has a right to want to do whatever he can to defeat the Russian threat. And so we'll continue to have those conversations, but I have no change to our policies to speak to today. I would add that in addition to supporting Ukraine, President Biden has been very, very focused on two other things. One, making sure that we're meeting our NATO commitments, and he's added an additional 20,000 troops to the continent of Europe as an example of that. But number two, to make sure that this conflict doesn't escalate, doesn't start World War III, doesn't become what Putin claims already that it is, that it's a U.S. versus Russia or West versus Russia or an attack by NATO. So we also have to worry about escalation issues here with respect to what Mr. Putin might or might not do. And that has been on our minds since, again, the beginning of the conflict.
And I hear you, John, but of course, NATO leaders would all agree that it is everyone's best interest if this war came to an end. So can you talk about the flip side, what the concerns are for the U.S. if it were to lift all of these restrictions?
Well, as I said, I mean, we're going to continue to have these conversations with the Ukrainians, and I won't get ahead of those conversations, but concerns about escalation are valid because I think we can all agree that an escalation of this conflict beyond just Ukraine is not only not good for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, but it's not good for anybody living on the European continent, and it's certainly not good for the American people. And the president has to weigh those decisions every time he's approving a new weapons package, every time he is providing guidance to Ukrainian leaders about how those weapons should be used. And they are using the weapons provided by the United States to very good effect. They have pushed back the Russians from Kharkiv. The Russians have failed to take Zaporizhia and other towns in the northeast of the country. And so now that we have the funding to support them, and the president announced a new package today, Ukrainians are, in fact, making this not a stalemate, but a very dynamic battlefront all along that line.
And of course, John, this would be a very different situation if Ukraine was a member of NATO. And leaders agreed this week that the country is on a, quote, irreversible track to becoming part of the alliance. We don't, however, have any details about when that might happen. So can you tell us anything about a timeline?
It's difficult to get into a specific timeline when they are at war right now. And obviously, membership in NATO at this time, while there's a war going on, means that NATO is, in fact, at war with Russia. So we got to make sure that they win this war first and foremost, and the president's doing everything he can to do that. Secondly, we got to make sure that whenever and however this war ends, and nobody can predict that, Ouija, we'd have to recognize that they're still going to have a long border with Russia and a still aggressive Russia. And we got to make sure that they have the defense capabilities they need to protect themselves when this war is over. And that's why the president just a couple of weeks ago signed a bilateral security agreement with President Zelensky. And then thirdly, to the question about NATO, to make sure that they are on a credible path to NATO membership. And that means doing all the things that any nation that wants to be part of the NATO alliance has to do, including governance issues and shoring up institutions and making sure that political reforms are on track. It's understandable that Ukraine hasn't had a whole heck of a lot of time to focus on those kinds of reforms right now while they're at war trying to defend themselves. But we are still going to work with them on those reforms and getting them on that path to NATO membership. It will happen. Clearly, the allies have said so. It's irreversible. They will become NATO allies. But we'll all have to be mindful of the path forward and the bridge to NATO membership.
And John, we expect to hear from President Biden directly about all of this as he hosts a press conference to wrap up the summit. Can you talk about how he's been preparing for this press conference? When is the last time you saw him, and whether he feels the pressure that is on him tonight?
I saw him just this morning. I saw him all day yesterday as he has been not only preparing for all the events here at the NATO summit, including his press conference, but also keeping tabs on the national security situation around the world. He's been constantly updated on all kinds of issues. He's looking forward to this opportunity to close out the NATO summit with a strong summation of it and with the opportunity to take questions from reporters. It's not something he shies away from. He's looking forward to it, and I guarantee you he'll be ready.
John, is there anything you can share about how he has been preparing for tonight to take questions from reporters? Obviously, after the debate, the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah, I know he prepares for press conferences the way he prepares for any major event, including all the meetings he's been having here at the NATO summit. He reads the material, the relevant material. He asks good questions of the staff, the national security team. He's been preparing in the same way that I've seen him prepare in the past for press conferences or for other major events. He'll be ready. He's looking forward to it. He knows it's a great opportunity to put this NATO summit into some context here at the very end of it.
And we are looking forward to it too. John Kirby, thank you so much.
You bet.
Well, if you've been following the 2024 election cycle, you've probably heard of Project 2025. We'll break down what it is and explain what the Biden and Trump teams are saying about it. You're streaming America Decides. In recent weeks, President Biden and other Democrats have been sounding the alarm on the potential dangers posed by a second Trump term by dropping the name Project 2025. 2 weeks ago, the Biden campaign even launched a website that outlines how the conservative plan would allegedly reshape the United States. But former President Trump says he knows, quote, nothing about Project 2025, and he's accusing Democrats of having a field day in trying to hook him to the policies it encompasses. CBS News campaign reporter Jake Rosen joins us now. So, Jake, what exactly is Project 2025, and what is it not?
So Project 2025 is a Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank. It's their transition plan for the next conservative president, whoever that may be. Now, obviously, this was launched in 2023 before the primary cycle played out. So this could have hypothetically applied to a Ron DeSantis or Vivek Ramaswamy or Nikki Haley. Now, in terms of Donald Trump, which is why this is advantageous for Democrats, is that the plans laid out in this handbook, 900 pages, which is what the Democrats have kind of seized on, but it also calls on kind of a LinkedIn-style training session and recruitment for young conservatives in D.C. to come in and help kind of break up the bureaucracy, as they call it. Mm-hmm. It's also a 180-day plan for the first conservative president. So when you kind of think about what it is, it's a suggestion for the next president. But if you're Donald Trump, you probably don't want this kind of outside group kind of seizing influence over what the branding of your next term would be.
So to be clear, it is not a Trump campaign platform.
Correct. And the Trump campaign has tried to distance themselves repeatedly. Trump campaign co-chairs Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles put a statement out when Project 2025 first kind of got in the news earlier this year, saying that they appreciate the efforts, but that, frankly, Trump will decide himself. And we saw a couple Truth Social posts in the last week by Donald Trump denouncing this group and saying he doesn't know whoever's running it and knows no one behind it. Now, obviously, that's not true, though. There are plenty of people, former higher-level White House staffers across all branches of government who wrote chapters in this book. They are definitely Trump-aligned people. But again, this is a think tank trying to propose something, and this goes all the way back to the Reagan administration in terms of the booklet that they give a conservative president when they win office, kind of a set of guidelines.
900 pages is a lot.
Yeah.
But talk to us about some of the more controversial elements that Democrats are really trying to highlight.
Well, the biggest two are something that Trump is for, which is these mass deportations, hardline on immigration. That aligns very closely with what the Project 2025 is suggesting they do, basically dismantling of DHS. It also calls for banning of mifepristone, the abortion pill drug, which Trump has said he does not support. And that's the kind of line that the Trump campaign is trying to draw. It also talks about banning trans people from the military, which is something that Trump did and Joe Biden undid. And it also calls for overhauling the tax system in America, which some conservatives would certainly be for. A conservative think tank obviously would suggest overhauling the tax system. But again, this is not the Trump official platform. This is just one conservative group. And the Trump campaign has tried to kind of forge this on their own terms by putting out an Agenda 47 on their website, which is Trump, in his own words, giving speeches to a camera about what he wants to do. And they've also outlined new changes in their Republican National Committee platform that came out earlier this week about what they want to do on things like abortion, the economy, immigration.
So there is overlap, to be
For sure,
fair.
there absolutely is. Yeah.
Okay, and when Trump says he knows nothing about it, how true is that?
Well, I don't believe that Trump has any actual influence over, how the day-to-day operations go in the Heritage Foundation. But the Heritage Foundation's president said earlier this week on a podcast that there's a lot of overlap and that they are hoping to implement this. Another former Trump staffer and very close Trump confidant in the first term of Trump's administration, he said that they hope to implement this when transition plans really come to fruition after the RNC this week, and that there will be overlap. So Democrats are calling attention to that no matter what the Trump campaign says, these are people that worked in the Trump White House. These are people that are probably angling maybe for another job. But it's a really easy way for Democrats to kind of brand what Trump is going forward, just like Trump has tried to do and did in 2016 with the Green New Deal or the new, and things like that, where he, stamps a label on it. Green New Scam is what he's been calling it lately. And while that's kind of a meaningless term because it never passed, it still carries a significance with the base. And right now what they're doing, Democrats across the board, DNC, Biden campaign, influencers online, they're all trying to brand on, for voters who are maybe not informed about what Trump carries in this next term, the policies that he does and lay it out with this Project 2025 branding, which is pretty hard to shake for the Trump campaign. It's definitely sticking.
Well, thank you for clearing it up for our voters and viewers, Jake Rosen. Thanks. Well, President Biden is facing calls to take a cognitive test. And now a prominent Democratic governor says she doesn't think it's a bad idea. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. As a growing number of Democratic lawmakers call on President Biden to step aside, we're learning more about whether voters agree. According to a new poll, 67% of respondents say Joe Biden should not continue his campaign. That includes a majority of his own supporters. Ashley Etienne and Matt Gorman join us now. Ashley served as communications director for Vice President Kamala Harris, and Matt is a Republican strategist who served as a senior advisor to Senator Tim Scott's presidential campaign. Thank you both so much for being here. So, Ashley, we see these polls, but they're not exactly asking, does that mean you won't vote for Joe Biden, right? So does he have time to turn this around?
He absolutely does, but he's continues to bleed support. They've not stopped the bleeding. I mean, it's three audiences he's got to be concerned with. One is the political class, the members of Congress. He's still bleeding a lot of that support, and not just in terms of numbers, but he's now losing support among members that are in key states that he has to win in the election, in these battleground states. Those members and their opinions matter more. The second is he's bleeding donors. The donor class is someone that he has to convince. And the third is the grassroots, and now they're meeting with delegates. Delegates are waking up asking, what does this mean for me and for us? So the problem, I feel like the president's problems are only mounting. And, I'm a crises communicator, and I've worked in that building twice, and I've just been shocked by how feckless to a degree. My former colleagues have been in terms of trying to change the narrative and turn the page.
What should they be doing that they're not doing?
Well, I mean, I think it was a mistake that the president didn't go up to meet with the caucus, or that he didn't call into the caucus meeting. I mean, your main concern is you've got to temper anxieties of these members of Congress when they're around reporters all week, and you can anticipate that they were going to get cornered and asked these questions. The other thing they can do is more strategically utilize the vice president. I appreciate that she's in North Carolina, but maybe she should have been meeting with senators. They sent up the campaign staff, and the campaign staff members walked away feeling not satisfied by what they heard. So that's, the other thing is you got NATO here. I've not even seen Blinken on television. Maybe he's busy in meetings, but if there's plenty of opportunity for them to try to change the narrative and turn the page, and they're not doing that. And I will say that's not engendering any confidence from the caucus.
And Matt, speaking of congressional Democrats, the NRCC is now rolling out attack ads attacking the down ballot candidates. Can you talk about how you think, the situation Joe Biden is in could impact those races?
Sure. I think, look, the panic you're seeing in the Democrat is because they probably had polls come back on Monday and Tuesday, and they woke up on Wednesday morning not liking where they were down ballot. And the NRCC, I think, has been very savvy with this because, look, there's a crisis in the White House right now in the campaign about what Joe Biden's future is. But then that cascades down ballot. We're certainly seeing who are two people that didn't go to the Senate meeting today, John Tester and Sherrod Brown. You have NRCC having trackers at the airports asking whether or not members of Congress not even want Joe Biden to be the nominee, but whether they can stay in office. And you have Marie Blumenkamp-Perez, who's a vulnerable Democrat out in Washington, saying floating that he might need to resign, let alone be the nominee. So they're smartly taking the situation, which is at the White House and the campaign, and making sure that Democrats down ballot feel the heat for it. It's smart.
And Ashley, I want to talk about some of those Democrats because your other former boss, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, despite everything that Joe Biden is saying, that he has made a decision that he is not leaving the race, she spoke very clearly yesterday and said that she hopes he comes to, a decision. What does it tell you that she's willing to come out in public and say and suggest that he is still deciding?
Well, she also said yesterday that she thinks that he can win in November. So I think that's also very important. But I think what she's doing strategically, and I've seen her do this many times, which is provide the caucus some space to deliberate among itself, to air out their grievances. They're going to, my understanding, what I'm hearing internally from the caucus, they're going to take those grievances, Mr. Jeffries, I think, said this today, to the White House, directly to the president, and lay them out for him, and then let him make an informed decision. I think that's her position on it. Not that he has not made a decision, but is it fully informed by all of the dynamics? And they weren't on Monday. But the other thing too is, members don't really take too lightly to you sending them a letter telling them to sit down and shut up, and go with it. So I think that he's got a lot more work to do, and she's also providing the president that space to do that work.
Well, and Matt, Donald Trump is giving a lot of space to the Democrats and to Joe Biden, and I'm told that that is their strategy right now. Do Republicans want Joe Biden to remain on the ticket? Is that their best bet, they think?
Look, if Joe Biden's the nominee, this race is going to be about him and his fitness for office, right? If Kamala's the nominee or somebody else, I think it's going to be only Kamala at this stage, then the race was about what we thought it'd be 2 weeks ago, right? Immigration, economy, and crime. So it kind of goes back to what it was a little bit pre-debate. But you're right. I think there's an intentional strategy here. And I'd say this regardless of the party, right? When your opponent is self-immolating, essentially, stand back. Don't insert yourself in it. And I think this speaks to, there's been a lot better discipline and a lot more of a professional organization around Trump for his third run. And I think what you're seeing is that come into play at times like this.
And very quickly for both of you, we're less than an hour away from President Biden's press conference. What will each of you be watching for?
I think there's going to be a lot of Democrats holding their breath, watching every minute of it. I think it's, watching for how strong he is. How coherently does he present his ideas? And if he does and he comes out of this thing looking strong, I mean, Democrats will have, especially those that are Team Biden, will have an argument that the president has now proven through an interview, through several interviews, through a press conference, through rallies and speeches, that he's with it, and that was an episode. It was episodic, that was just a bad night.
You know, I'm waiting to see for how quickly when he leaves the stage does the cascade of press releases from House Democrats and congressional Democrats start coming. Because, look, I thought he was going to gut this out if you asked me about 72 hours ago. Last 48 hours, 24 hours, I think that's no longer the case. I'm waiting to see if it's just a matter of time and people are waiting for NATO and the press conference to end to still call for it.
All right, Matt Gorman, Ashley Etienne, we will be waiting alongside with you. Thank you so much. Hungary's Viktor Orban is meeting with former President Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Next, we'll hear from the Prime Minister's political director. You're streaming America Decides. As world leaders depart the NATO summit in Washington, one of them will make a stop tonight at Mar-a-Lago to meet with Donald Trump. Viktor Orban is Hungary's prime minister, a problematic NATO ally who has also become an icon within certain factions of the American conservative movement. His political director spoke with our Margaret Brennan ahead of that meeting.
Your prime minister, is he delivering a message that comes out of his meetings with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping? Is he delivering one to Mr. Trump?
No, it's our duty, according to our understanding, is to collect information and to collect messages. We are a small country, so we are not a decisive player in this conflict, but no one is there or brave enough to play a mediative role. I think somebody has to take action because,
But did you see any proof that there was any interest on the part of Russia in actually ending the war? Was there any message that Vladimir Putin conveyed?
Well, I think that the current discussions about peace are going to a bad direction in general because everybody believes or at least communicates that this war will end in a way that somebody is dictating a detailed peace plan and the other party will accept it. But it's not going to happen. In those conflicts where you don't have a clear winning or losing side, a peace process goes the other way around. So first, restore communication channels, and then, try to agree on a short-term ceasefire, and then use it as a window of opportunity to sit down and negotiate more complicated things. And I think it's a positive sign from all. It's a positive sign from all sides that we were received in Kiev, in Beijing, in Moscow, and in Washington as well. So
back in March, when your prime minister went to Mar-a-Lago and visited Donald Trump for the first time that we know of, he gave an interview afterwards, and he said, your prime minister, that Donald Trump told him the United States would not give another penny to Ukraine if he's reelected president, and that would end the war. Is that still your understanding? And if that is the case, doesn't that just end a war on Russia's terms? And Russia started this war. It sounds like defeat for Ukraine.
Well, but Donald Trump, when he was a president, we have firsthand experience. He was a president for like 4 years. And back at that time, the entire world was a more peaceful and stable place. He did have really big diplomatic success in Middle East, Abraham Accords. There was no conflict in Ukraine. So what we experience is that he is capable of doing something, and he's capable of stopping the war. He has to know how he can achieve his goals and the American goals, but the current American administration strategy, which is about continuation of the war and fueling further conflict, according to our view, it leads us nowhere.
But Russia invaded in 2014. Donald Trump did nothing to remove those troops. He did provide Javelin missiles to Ukraine to fight the Russians. So he could have stopped a war then, theoretically, and didn't. The U.S. ambassador, David Pressman, gave a pretty scathing speech last week. He said no other ally or partner of the United States is overtly and tirelessly campaigning for a specific candidate in the U.S. election and is convinced it only helps, and he thinks your prime minister is convinced it helps Hungary or at least helps him personally. I'm not sure which. Which is it?
Well, me neither. So we are not campaigning for anybody. We are just European allies, and we are here to explain what the consequences of American policy
Your
decisions.
Prime Minister has endorsed Donald Trump.
American policy decisions are on us. This is what we do. And we are very open in that the previous administration, their policy decisions were much better for Europe, according to our understanding, and for Hungary than the current administration decisions. This is the American democratic side. Sorry to say that, but it's proven, it's a factual thing, who are financing Hungarian opposition, liberal opposition, through media, through NGOs, through think tanks, through direct political financing, because they want to get rid of with conservative governments. I think
the U.S. is a NATO member. We are allies.
Yes, I agree.
If your country was attacked, the United States military would be required to defend it.
And if your country is attacked, the Hungarian military will be here to help you.
But exactly, and has in other conflicts. But that's sort of the point, which is why mix ideology into it?
This is my question.
Because the U.S. and Hungary are allies. Why come out
this is my
in
question
an election year and endorse Donald Trump? Because it makes it about ideology.
No, I mean, it's a response. It's a response. Because really, I don't know whether the American voters are aware of the fact that their money goes directly through channels to finance opposition everywhere, finance those governments which are, from an ideological point of view, disagree with the current administration.
And Margaret, his Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, is also very controversial, especially because of his recent meeting with Russia's President Vladimir Putin. But he has a lot of love from American conservatives, including J.D. Vance, a potential vice president pick for Donald Trump. He just came on your show, Face the Nation, and said as much. Is that the case throughout the conservative movement?
No, but it is such an interesting fascination that people as prominent as J.D. Vance praise things that Viktor Orban did, like seizing control of state universities. Tucker Carlson has really praised what Viktor Orban has done. And to be clear, the U.S. State Department has criticized him for cracking down on a free press. Reporters Without Borders calls him a predator of press freedom, restricting the freedom of the judiciary. I mean, he has really rolled out this law that is completely anti-gay and arguably discriminatory. So there is the reason that European leaders point to him and say he is a problem child. He's also stood directly in the way of approval for aid to Ukraine. This is the only country that's not giving military aid. They're giving other kinds of support. But this is one of those contrasts you're seeing in the conservative movement. It was Leader McConnell who went to the floor of the Senate in March and said to conservatives, this is not who you take your cues from. He's cozying up to Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Iran, something that Director Orban pushed back on, saying this is all with an interest of peace.
Margaret Brennan, thank you so much. Well, President Biden just spoke briefly at the NATO summit. Let's take a listen.
Close this conference. Good afternoon, everyone. When Putin launched his brutal war over 2 years ago, I promised President Zelensky the United States and our allies and our partners would stand with him for the people of Ukraine as they defended their country. Since then, all of you, all my fellow leaders, have built a global coalition to support Ukraine, supplied economic and humanitarian support, supplied weapons that Ukraine needs to defend itself. And 2 days ago, I announced a historic donation of air defense equipment to protect Ukrainian cities, troops, and from Russian missiles. And here today, with all these important people behind me, we take another important step in our collective support for Ukraine. We refer to it as the Ukraine Compact. And here's how it works. Last year, the G7 nations signed onto a declaration to protect Ukraine long term, not just for the duration of this war, but beyond after they win.
And during that Ukraine Compact event, we are learning that President Biden called President Zelensky President Putin, which is for sure something he will have to answer to when we hear more from the president later tonight. The Republican National Convention kicks off Monday in Milwaukee. The mayor of Wisconsin's largest city joins us next to tell us how officials are preparing. You're streaming America Decides. We are just 4 days away from the event that will officially name Donald Trump the GOP's presidential nominee. The Republican National Convention is kicking off in Milwaukee on Monday. The 4-day event will feature televised speeches from several high-profile Republicans and is widely expected to serve as Trump's platform for announcing his running mate. Milwaukee Mayor Cavalier Johnson joins us now. Great to see you, Mayor, and thank you for making time for us.
Thanks for having me.
So talk to me about the atmosphere in your city now that we are just less than 1 week away before the RNC.
The atmosphere here is electric. It reminds me of the Republican debate, the first one in the cycle, the primary cycle in August of last year. Of course, it was a very hot day that day, so it almost felt like you could cut the energy with a knife. It's picking up in the city all around the Republican convention coming up next week.
And how has your city prepared for both the influx of people coming as well as the expected protests that follow both candidates?
Well, fortunately, in the city of Milwaukee, we had a runway because we had won the Democratic National Convention back in 2020. Now, unfortunately, as we all know, that turned to be a mostly virtual event. But anyhow, we've continued to work with our partners in law enforcement. The Milwaukee Police Department has been great. The police chief, Jeffrey Norman, has been outstanding, working with a number of police chiefs across Wisconsin and across the United States. Pull in some support here. We worked in a bipartisan way with Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate in order to increase the security grant for these large-scale conventions. So it'll affect a battleground state in our convention in Milwaukee, the Republican National Convention here, Chicago, and the Democratic National Convention in the solidly blue state. And then in 2028 should lay the groundwork to also benefit a solidly red state in terms of the Republican National Convention going to Houston in that year.
And you are a Democrat leading the most populous city in one of America's battleground states. We are seeing a growing number of Democratic lawmakers call on President Biden to step down, but you have been highly supportive of him on social media. Can you talk about why you feel that's important to be so vocal in this moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I can. And I think those Democrats are wrong. I think they're wildly out of step. Joe Biden is the nominee, will be the nominee. I'm proud to be a delegate to go to Chicago next month and to support President Joe Biden's reelection. And think about this. I mean, those folks are making their statements after the debate performance. And I just was on a phone call with mayors from across the country and the president owned up to his debate performance. He didn't blame anybody else. He took that responsibility on himself. But even so, even remarkably so, after that debate performance, between the binary choice of Joe Biden and Donald Trump, it still is remarkable that people say that Joe Biden is and should be the Democratic nominee and will be the president of the United States. When you contrast these two men and their records in office, right? Joe Biden has a record of accomplishment, bipartisan work, bipartisan infrastructure law, bipartisan Chips and Science Act, the American Rescue Plan Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, so many others. Donald Trump is leading on a path to dictatorship. He said he wanted to be a dictator. He's got Project 2025 that lays the groundwork to do that. The playbook, the Supreme Court has given the green light to do that. Joe Biden is working for folks in the middle class and the bottom up. Donald Trump looks out for himself, and his one major policy achievement was a tax cut for the very wealthy in this country. We know who's the person who's going to be looking out for us. That's Joe Biden, and I'm looking forward to not just supporting him next month at the convention, but also supporting him in November. And I think he'll win Milwaukee, he'll win Wisconsin, and he'll win re-election to the presidency.
All right. Well, Mayor Cavalier Johnson, thank you so much, and best of luck to you as you host that massive event next week.
Thank you.
Our America Decides team will have special coverage of the Republican National Convention next Monday through Thursday, starting at 5 p.m. Eastern. Stay with us all night and all week long. That does it for today. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.